The lights of Hollywood have a cruel way of reflecting only what the world wants to see. On the surface, Brad Pitt, at 61, appears untouchable. A man whose face has been sculpted into legend, whose charm has filled theaters, whose name has become shorthand for stardom itself. To the millions who still remember him as the drifter in Thelma, Eloise, or the rebel leader in Fight Club, he is a symbol of eternal youth, an icon whose presence alone once carried the promise of glamour. But beneath the golden image lies a different story, one marked by private heartbreak, betrayal, and the suffocating burden of fame that does not forgive even its brightest stars. There is something tragic in watching a man who once had everything: beauty, talent, wealth, and love, arrive at an age where the mirrors no longer flatter, and the wounds of the past refuse to heal. At 61, Brad Pitt is not merely a Hollywood actor. He is a man who has lived inside two parallel worlds. One is built by the tabloids, filled with glossy photographs, red carpet smiles, and box office triumphs. The other is the world he wakes up to when the cameras are gone. A fractured family, legal battles that seem endless, and the loneliness of a man who, despite global adoration, spends his nights staring into silence. The tragedy of Brad Pitt is not sudden, like the accidents that stole James Dean or River Phoenix. It is slow, grinding, and unbearably human. It is the tragedy of a man who climbed higher than most, only to discover that the summit was built on fragile ground. For every award and every standing ovation, there was a hidden cost: years of emotional exhaustion, bitter public divorces, estranged children who no longer look at him with love, and the gnawing suspicion that happiness was never meant for him in the first place. What makes his story heartbreaking is not the fall from grace, because Brad Pitt has never truly fallen. He is still a movie star, still working, still relevant. No, the real heartbreak is the quiet, invisible suffering that shadows his steps, the suffering that fame cannot disguise. At 61, the man once crowned as the sexiest alive has found himself living in an emotional exile, a figure admired by strangers but distanced from those who once mattered most. The question that lingers is painfully simple. How can a man who had the world in his hands end up so alone? The answer lies in the life behind the curtain, where stories rarely end in the happy ever-afters that Hollywood scripts. Brad Pitt's story is one of contradictions. He has been celebrated as a devoted father, yet painted by his ex-wife as a dangerous man, unfit to raise his children. He has been heralded as an Oscar-winning producer with a sharp eye for art, yet whispered about as a broken soul who finds no comfort in success. He has been the golden boy of cinema, yet a man plagued by inner demons that money and fame could never silence. When the clock struck 61, Brad Pitt stood at a crossroads, not on screen, but in his real life. His battle with Angelina Jolie over custody still raged on, tearing open old wounds in public courtrooms. His children, once the center of his universe, have grown distant, some reportedly cutting off contact altogether. To a man who built his identity on being the heart of a family, this estrangement is perhaps the cruelest wound of all. The tabloids report it as gossip, but to Pitt, it is a daily torment. A reminder that the empire he once cherished, the home filled with laughter, love, and the promise of forever, has crumbled into silence. Fame does not protect from sorrow. If anything, it magnifies it. The world watches Pitt's heartbreak unfold as if it were another Hollywood production, forgetting that behind the headlines is a man with a heart, one that has been scarred by betrayal, disappointment, and the relentless pressure of being Brad Pitt. Unlike the characters he played, he cannot punch his way out like Tyler Durden or ride off into the sunset like Tristan Ludlow. He must endure in the harsh light of reality, a reality that strips away the myth and reveals the man. And yet, perhaps the cruelest irony is that Pitt still performs. He still walks carpets, attends premieres, flashes that million-dollar smile, and reminds audiences why they once believed in him as more than an actor, but as a symbol of what Hollywood could create. Behind the practiced charm, though, lies a fragility that even he cannot fully conceal anymore. To those who look closely, the sadness in his eyes is unmistakable. A sadness that says, "Yes, I was once everything. And yet, I am still searching for something I may never find." The tragedy of Brad Pitt at 61 is not just his. It is the tragedy of Hollywood itself, an industry that builds gods out of men, only to leave them stranded when the illusion fades. He remains admired, yes, but admiration is not love. He remains famous, yes, but fame does not hold his hand at night. He remains wealthy, yes, but money cannot buy the laughter of his children, the warmth of a partner who stays, or the peace of a heart unburdened. And so the story begins. Brad Pitt, the golden man in shadows, the legend who is living proof that even the brightest light casts the darkest shadow. His journey is not over, but as he stands at 61, the heartbreak is undeniable. A reminder that behind every Hollywood smile, there is often a hidden storm. Long before the world knew his name, long before his face adorned billboards and magazines, William Bradley Pitt was just a boy growing up in Springfield, Missouri. On the surface, his childhood looked ordinary. A modest, middle American family, church on Sundays, and a home filled with the values of discipline and faith. But beneath this carefully built image of normalcy lay the foundations of a deeper conflict. The kind of emotional pressure that would leave scars even the brightest spotlight could not erase. Brad was the eldest child, the one expected to set an example. His father, Bill Pitt, was a stern man, a figure who believed in order, in rules, in keeping emotions tightly under control. His mother, Jane, was deeply religious, her world guided by strict faith and the ideals of morality. In this environment, young Brad learned two lessons that would follow him for the rest of his life. Hide your feelings and never let anyone see you weak. It was this mask of composure first taught at the dinner table in Springfield that would later become his survival weapon in Hollywood. Yet, it also planted the seeds of loneliness. For a boy who longed for freedom, creativity, and expression, the weight of expectation felt suffocating. He smiled when he was supposed to, he obeyed when demanded, but inside, he carried a restless energy that sought escape. High school became that escape. Brad was charismatic, athletic, and handsome, the kind of boy people naturally gravitated toward. But even then, behind the easy smile, there was a nagging sense of incompleteness. Friends recalled how he seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He could fit in with the jocks, charm the teachers, and make the girls laugh. But when the noise quieted, Brad often withdrew into himself, as if searching for something beyond the borders of his small-town life. After high school, he enrolled at the University of Missouri, majoring in journalism with a focus on advertising. It seemed like a practical path, one that matched the values instilled by his family. Yet, just 2 weeks before graduation, he walked away. Something inside told him that a life spent in offices, selling ideas for products, would suffocate the restless dreamer he still carried within. With little more than a few $100s in his pocket and a conviction he could not explain, Brad Pitt drove to Los Angeles, chasing a dream even he could barely articulate. Hollywood did not welcome him with open arms. He arrived as just another face among thousands, waiting tables, dressing as a giant chicken outside a fast food restaurant to pay rent. The glamour of stardom was nowhere in sight, but there was a hunger in him, a drive that had been forged in those childhood years of discipline and expectation. He knew how to endure, how to smile even when tired, how to project confidence even when uncertainty gnawed at his insides. This duality, the boy trained to hide pain and the man desperate to express it, became the paradox at the heart of Brad Pitt. Casting directors began to notice him, first in commercials, then in small TV roles. His looks, of course, opened doors. But it was more than that. He carried in his eyes a vulnerability that seemed to contradict his golden exterior. Audiences did not just see a handsome man. They sensed the unresolved story behind his smile. It was this quality that made his breakout in Thelma, Louise unforgettable. As the charming drifter, he was irresistible. But there was also a melancholy, a sense that beneath the swagger, the character was already halfway broken. Brad wasn't just playing a role. He was channeling the tension that had been living inside him since childhood. Hollywood might have crowned him the new golden boy, but deep down, he remained the boy from Missouri, still longing for something he could not name. As success grew, so did the expectations. He became a symbol of perfection, a face and body sculpted into fantasy, a man whose every move was watched, dissected, and desired. Yet, with every new title, every magazine cover, the paradox only deepened. To the world, Brad Pitt was the man who had it all. To himself, he was still the boy, trained not to cry, not to break, not to reveal. This inner conflict is what makes his story so deeply tragic. Fame did not free him from the pressures of his childhood. It only amplified them. The mask of composure became more polished, the smile more rehearsed, the illusion more powerful. But behind closed doors, Brad Pitt was still searching for love that lasted, for children who would not slip away, for peace that no award could bring. Even at 61, the echoes of that Missouri home still haunt him. He has admitted in interviews that his struggle with alcohol was, in many ways, a way to numb pain he could not face. He has confessed that vulnerability does not come easily to him, that he spent years hiding emotions because that was what life taught him. And while the world still sees the Hollywood icon, Brad himself often seems trapped between the boy who could never truly speak his truth and the man who fears it may now be too late. The tragedy, then, is not just in what Brad Pitt lost along the way: marriages, family, trust, but in what he never fully found. From a childhood where emotions were silenced to a stardom where emotions were sold, his life has been a long performance, one that leaves him, even at 61, searching for a script where he is allowed to simply be human. And so, as the world continues to celebrate him, to photograph him, to gossip about him, Brad Pitt carries within a truth the cameras rarely capture: that even the most admired man in the world can remain a prisoner of shadows cast long ago. When Brad Pitt first appeared on screen in Thelma, Louise 1991, audiences felt a shift. The moment he leaned against that motel wall with his cowboy hat tilted just so, the camera did not just capture an actor, it announced a star. Hollywood has a history of immortalizing faces, of turning ordinary men into gods, and in Brad Pitt, it found a figure who seemed too perfect to be real. He had the sculpted cheekbones of a Greek statue, the charm of a con man, and the vulnerability of a poet. It was not simply that he was beautiful. It was that his beauty carried a story. From that role, the path seemed inevitable. Hollywood quickly realized it had struck gold, and the offers poured in. A River Runs Through It 1992 confirmed what many suspected: Brad Pitt could act. He was not just a pretty face. He was an actor capable of embodying depth, of carrying emotion beneath the surface. His performance as Paul McLean, the charming, troubled younger brother, felt like a reflection of himself. A man admired but internally conflicted. A man who shined brightest when hiding shadows. The 1990s belonged to him. Legends of the Fall, 7, Meet Joe Black. Fight Club, each film cemented his myth, each role adding another layer to his evolving identity. As Tristan Ludlow in Legends of the Fall, He became the archetype of the tragic romantic hero. Wild, uncontainable, and doomed by fate. As Detective Mills in Seven, he embodied the everyman swallowed by a world of horror. His final scream, "What's in the box?" etched into cinematic memory. And then came Fight Club 1999, where he transformed into Tyler Durden, a role that would define an era. Durden was not just a character. He was an idea, a symbol of rebellion, chaos, and masculine disillusionment at the turn of the century. Brad Pitt became the face of a cultural moment, the icon of a generation questioning consumerism, identity, and the meaning of existence. The irony was undeniable. Here was the most beautiful man in the world, playing a character who preached the destruction of beauty and the futility of chasing perfection. Audiences worshipped him, but Brad himself seemed to understand the bitter contradiction. He was trapped inside the very myth Tyler sought to destroy. With fame came fortune, and with fortune came scrutiny. Every haircut, every relationship, every late-night appearance became news. Hollywood loves to build, but it also loves to dissect. Brad Pitt's romances became global obsessions. His marriage to Jennifer Aniston, America's sweetheart, was seen as the union of perfection. They were the golden couple, their photos plastered on every magazine. But even then, cracks were forming. Brad once admitted that he felt his life was becoming a sitcom, that the perfection of it all felt strangely suffocating. It was on the set of Mr. Mrs. Smith, 2005, that destiny shifted. His chemistry with Angelina Jolie was volcanic, undeniable. And soon, the narrative of Hollywood's golden boy took a darker turn. To the public, it was betrayal. To Brad, it was an awakening. Jolie represented danger, passion, and rebellion, everything that seemed to contradict the polished world he had built with Aniston. When the marriage collapsed, tabloids feasted, painting Pitt as both villain and victim. His personal life reduced to headlines that overshadowed his work. Yet his career refused to dim. In the years that followed, Pitt carefully built himself not only as an actor, but as a serious producer. With his company, Plan B Entertainment, he backed films like The Departed, 12 Years a Slave, and Moonlight, all Oscar winners, all testaments to his vision for storytelling that went beyond his own face. It was as if Brad Pitt sought redemption not on screen, but behind the camera, proving that he was more than Hollywood's golden ornament. But even in success, the personal shadows grew heavier. The relationship with Jolie, once worshipped as a modern fairy tale, transformed into a battlefield. Together they had 6 children, biological and adopted, and for a while the image of Brangelina seemed unstoppable. They traveled the world, spoke on humanitarian issues, and built a family that symbolized unity beyond borders. But behind closed doors, storms brewed. Arguments escalated, trust eroded, and soon the image collapsed. By the time Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, 2019, earned him his long-awaited Oscar for acting, Brad Pitt should have been at peace. He stood on stage, charming and graceful, thanking those who believed in him. To the world, it was his crowning moment. The final confirmation that Brad Pitt was not just a star. He was a legend. But to those who looked closer, there was a melancholy in his acceptance speech, a sense that the victory came too late, that it could not erase the years of personal chaos that had consumed him. Hollywood had crowned its golden son, yes, but the crown weighed heavy. For every triumph, there was loss. For every smile, there was pain. The rise of Brad Pitt was meteoric, but as the years passed, the higher he climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath him became. By 61, the glory of his ascent still shone, but the loneliness of the man who lived it had become impossible to ignore. What began as a Missouri boy's restless dream had turned into a saga of brilliance and heartbreak, a story where the rise itself became part of the tragedy. Because sometimes the cruelest fate is not to fall, but to rise so high that falling becomes inevitable. If the 1990s had crowned Brad Pitt the Golden Prince of Hollywood, the 2000s sought to transform him into its king. And for a time, he seemed to embody everything: career success, global influence, and most of all, a family that appeared almost mythical in its perfection. With Angelina Jolie by his side, Pitt projected the image of a man who had found not only love, but also purpose. Together, they adopted children from Cambodia and Ethiopia, gave birth to their own, and became a blended family of 6. For millions around the world, Brangelina was not just a couple. They were an empire, a living fairy tale. But fairy tales rarely survive reality. Behind the photographs of glamorous red carpets and humanitarian missions lay a marriage that was fraying under the weight of its own intensity. Both Brad and Angelina were passionate, stubborn, and larger-than-life personalities. The more children filled their home, the more responsibility strained their bond, and as their careers pulled them in opposite directions, one filming on location in Europe, the other taking on directing projects in Africa or the Middle East, the cracks widened. What began as whispered arguments soon grew into public storms. Brad, who had long used alcohol as a crutch, found himself spiraling. In his own words, he was boozing too much, numbing emotions he could not face. Angelina, who had weathered her own struggles with health and identity, became increasingly distant. The image of unity that once captivated the press dissolved into suspicion and resentment. And in 2016, everything shattered. It happened on a plane, during what should have been a routine family trip. Reports later claimed that an argument erupted between Brad and one of the children, escalating into an altercation that left the rest of the family shaken. The details remain contested, clouded by legal documents and differing accounts, but the fallout was undeniable. Angelina filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and demanded full custody of the children. In the blink of an eye, Brad Pitt went from Hollywood's ultimate family man to a father fighting desperately not to lose his children. Tabloids splashed headlines of abuse, addiction, and betrayal. Every move was dissected: his rehab sessions, his court appearances, his strained attempts to reconnect with the children who once clung to him with adoration. For Brad, this was not just a divorce, it was an exile. His home, once filled with laughter, became quiet. The photographs of his children on the fridge became symbols of absence rather than presence. The man who once stood proudly as a father of 6 was suddenly described as a danger, a liability, a man unfit to raise his own family. To the world, it was scandal. To him, it was heartbreak in its purest form. Years passed, but the wounds never healed. Angelina and Brad remained locked in one of Hollywood's most bitter custody battles, a war that dragged through courts across continents. At times, judges seemed to favor Brad. At others, Angelina's accusations regained strength. But the true victims were the children, caught in a tug-of-war between two parents who once swore they would protect them above all else. For Brad, each estrangement cut deeper than the last. Some of his children reportedly stopped speaking to him altogether. At graduations and birthdays, he was absent, not because he chose to be, but because the chasm between him and his family had grown too wide. To a man who built his identity around being a father, this loss was unbearable. It was not simply that he missed them. It was that he feared they no longer wanted him. The tragedy of Brad Pitt at 61 is etched most clearly in this loss. Fame, awards, and fortune mean little when the voices of your children are no longer within reach. He has spoken cautiously in interviews, admitting responsibility for his past, acknowledging the damage done, but also expressing a longing to heal. Yet healing has proven elusive. The legal battles remain unresolved, the estrangements persistent. Hollywood still cheers for him, but the people he most wants to hear from remain silent. And the public, cruel as ever, has treated his pain as entertainment. Headlines frame him as a fallen hero. Paparazzi capture his loneliness, and social media speculates about his failures as if they were plot twists in a movie. Few stop to remember that behind the myth of Brad Pitt is a man who goes to bed alone. His phone quiet. His family fractured. It is in this loneliness that the full weight of his tragedy emerges. He is still admired, still desired, still able to command millions at the box office, yet none of it fills the void left by children who no longer rush into his arms. His story is not one of financial ruin or career collapse. It is the quieter, crueler tragedy of emotional exile. At 61, Brad Pitt remains a star, but in his own words, he is still figuring out how to be at peace. He gardens, he sculpts, he surrounds himself with art and quiet hobbies meant to soothe a restless soul. But no amount of stone carving can replace the laughter of a child. No vineyard in France can substitute for the warmth of family dinners. No Oscar can erase the sting of a Father's Day spent alone. And so, the man who once symbolized everything Hollywood could promise, love, success, beauty, immortality, now stands as proof of what Hollywood can take away. His tragedy is not a headline. It is a life unfolding in slow motion, each year marking another step away from the dream he once held. Another reminder that even the brightest lights eventually cast the darkest shadows. At 61, Brad Pitt still moves through the world with the aura of a legend. Cameras flash when he steps onto red carpets, journalists still hang on his words, and magazines continue to crown him with titles that speak of immortality. Hollywood royalty, the last movie star, the icon of a generation. Yet behind the images carefully captured and curated lies a far quieter reality. A man living alone, carrying both the triumphs and the wounds of a lifetime, searching for meaning in spaces where applause cannot follow. The years following his divorce reshaped his life in ways even he could not have foreseen. Gone were the days of sprawling family trips, of children filling his homes with noise, of the warm chaos that once defined his mornings. Instead, his estates became sanctuaries of solitude. His Los Angeles compound, though still buzzing with staff and security, often feels to him like a shell, a fortress without a family. His French vineyard, Chateau Miraval, once a symbol of unity with Angelina, now stands as a battlefield in the courts, its rows of vines whispering not of romance, but of loss. Brad Pitt, the man who once embodied Hollywood's golden dream, has grown quieter, more introspective. He has spoken about his attempts to rebuild through creativity. Sculpting in his art studio, designing furniture, even immersing himself in architecture, these pursuits are not vanity projects. They are lifelines, ways to shape order from chaos, to leave marks on the world that are not defined by scandal or celebrity. Yet, in the silence of his studios, one imagines the lingering echo of absence, the knowledge that creation is no substitute for connection. The tragedy of Brad Pitt at 61 is not the loss of fame. He remains, undeniably, a star. Directors still call, scripts still arrive, and fans still cheer. It is not even the loss of fortune. His wealth is vast, his investments secure. No, his tragedy lies in the absence of what cannot be bought or reclaimed. Time with his children, the intimacy of partnership, the simplicity of family. His exile is emotional, not material, and it is here that the weight of his story becomes unbearable. There is a cruel irony in how the world perceives him. To outsiders, Brad Pitt seems blessed beyond comprehension, adored by millions, wealthy beyond measure, still possessing the kind of face that defies age. But what is often forgotten is that the applause fades, The cameras leave, and when the doors close, Brad Pitt is left with the same silence that haunts every man who has lost what matters most. He has wealth, but not warmth, fame, but not trust, legacy, but not laughter. In interviews, he has tried to put words to this dissonance. He has admitted to years of depression, to battles with addiction, to the hollow victories of fame. He has spoken about quitting alcohol, about trying to rebuild himself piece by piece, about learning late in life how to feel what he was taught as a boy to suppress. These confessions do not come easily to him. Vulnerability never has. But when he does open up, the truth is raw. I carried too much pain for too long, and yet he endures. Part of the heartbreak of his story is the resilience he continues to show, even as life strips away the illusions. He still acts, still creates, still seeks beauty in the world around him. His Oscar for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was not merely a professional triumph, it was a symbolic one. Proof that after decades of being Hollywood's poster boy, he could still command respect as an artist. And yet, the glow of that golden statue fades quickly when set against the reality of evenings spent alone. At 61, Brad Pitt's life is a study in contrasts. The world calls him timeless, yet he feels the weight of time more acutely than ever. His career remains luminous, yet his private life is defined by fractures that refuse to mend. He is one of the most recognized men alive, yet he is haunted by the anonymity of loneliness. In this paradox lies his tragedy. To be worshipped by millions, but estranged from the few whose love truly matters. Those who see him at events note the gentleness in his demeanor, the humility that contrasts with the arrogance of many stars. Perhaps it is suffering that has softened him, perhaps loss that has given him perspective. He no longer seems to chase the frenzy of stardom. Instead, he drifts through it, like a man who has seen behind the curtain and knows its tricks. But the sadness is there, etched in the lines of his face, in the weariness behind his smile. The image of Brad Pitt at 61 is not one of collapse, but of endurance, endurance laced with heartbreak. He has not self-destructed like so many stars before him, yet he has not found the peace he craves. He has survived, but survival is not the same as joy. And as the years stretch ahead, the question that lingers is whether he will ever discover a life where applause is replaced by authentic affection, where legacy is measured not in awards, but in reconciliations. In the end, his story is a mirror, reflecting not only his own pain, but also the fragile nature of everything Hollywood promises. Beauty fades, love fractures, fame turns cruel, and even legends find themselves walking alone. Brad Pitt, the man who once had it all, now reminds us that having it all often comes at the price of losing what matters most. And so he walks forward, quietly, gracefully, carrying the weight of 61 years of brilliance and heartbreak. To the world, he is still the star. To himself, he is still searching for the role that matters most. A man who can finally lay down the masks, silence the storms, and find peace in simply being Brad. Brad Pitt has always been a man of images, the image of the heartthrob, the rebel, the family man, the golden boy of Hollywood. But at 61, the mirror he looks into tells a different story. It is no longer the mirror that flatters, the one held up by the world's applause. It is the mirror of age, of honesty, of quiet reckoning. And in that mirror, Brad confronts the question that haunts every legend. What remains when the beauty fades, when the marriages crumble, when the children drift away? What remains when the man is stripped of the myth? In many ways, Pitt's life has been defined by roles not just on screen, but in reality. He has played the dutiful son, the devoted husband, the passionate lover, the doting father, the activist, the artist. Each role has shaped the public's perception of him, but few have revealed the inner man. For decades, He let others write his narrative. Directors who cast him as the icon, tabloids that painted him as the villain, fans who projected onto him fantasies of perfection. Now, in the quiet of his 60s, he seems intent on rewriting that script for himself. Part of this rewriting has been an embrace of art beyond acting. In his studios, surrounded by stone and clay, Pitt sculpts with a kind of desperation, as if every chisel strike is a conversation with the pain he cannot put into words. He has said that sculpting is meditative, that it allows him to release emotions he once drowned in alcohol, but it is also symbolic. The act of reshaping raw material into form, of carving meaning from chaos. Perhaps he hopes that in shaping stone, he might learn how to reshape his life. He has also turned to reflection through therapy, something he once resisted. For a man raised to suppress feelings, therapy is an act of rebellion, a refusal to remain silent, a decision to unmask the vulnerability that fame forced him to hide. Those close to him say he has become gentler, more patient, more willing to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it. It is growth, yes, but growth born of suffering, the kind that comes only after life has stripped away illusions. Yet, even as he grows, the shadows remain. His children are still distant, the custody battles unresolved, the wounds between him and Angelina unhealed. Time, cruel as ever, marches forward. The longer the estrangement lasts, the more permanent it threatens to become. For a man who once carried the image of the perfect family, the reality of disconnection gnaws at him. No award, no creative pursuit, no new romance can fill that void. The public continues to consume his story like entertainment, dissecting every new relationship rumor, every court filing, every candid photograph. When he appeared at recent events with younger women, headlines screamed, "Brad's new love!" as if his personal life were still the world's property. But behind the headlines lies a quieter truth. Pitt's relationships have become more cautious, more guarded. He is no longer the man swept up by whirlwind passion. He is wary now, scarred by betrayals, aware of how fragile intimacy can be when lived under a microscope. And so, he drifts. Not in freefall, not destroyed, but drifting between the man he once was and the man he still hopes to become. At 61, he speaks of gratitude, of finding joy in small things. Cooking, listening to music, sharing wine with friends. But there is a melancholy in his gratitude, a sense that it is a consolation prize rather than a fulfillment. Gratitude for survival is not the same as gratitude for wholeness. The tragedy of Brad Pitt is that his legacy, though brilliant, is haunted by incompleteness. He has the films, the awards, the iconic roles. Generations will remember him as Tristan, as Tyler Durden, as Cliff Booth. He will forever be etched into Hollywood's golden history. But when it comes to his personal life, his legacy is fractured. Will his children remember him as the father who fought for them, or the father from whom they felt estranged? Will history remember him as the man who built an empire with Angelina Jolie, or as the man who lost it all in flames? And yet, there is still hope. Fragile, but present. Pitt has always been a man of resilience. He has survived scandals, ridicule, heartbreak, and the crushing weight of expectation. He is still here, still creating, still searching. Perhaps his greatest role is the one he has not yet played. The role of a man who finds peace, not in perfection, but in forgiveness. Forgiveness of others, yes, but more importantly, forgiveness of himself. Because beneath all the headlines and performances lies a truth Brad has struggled to accept. That he is, after all, only human. That he is allowed to break, to fail, to hurt. That the boy from Missouri, who was taught to hide his emotions, can finally lay them bare. That the man who once symbolized Hollywood's unreachable fantasy can finally live as himself, unadorned, unmasked, unchained. At 61, Brad Pitt's story is not over, but it is no longer the story of a golden rise. It is the story of survival, of reckoning, of a man standing before the mirror and asking not, "How do they see me?" but "Who am I?" Truly, it is the story of heartbreak, yes, but also of the faint possibility that heartbreak, endured long enough, can become the soil for something resembling peace. And so the legend continues, not on screen, but in silence. Brad Pitt, the man the world once adored beyond reason, now lives with the knowledge that adoration is fleeting, but truth endures. The question remains whether he will find that truth before time runs out, whether the final chapters of his life will be defined not by tragedy, but by redemption. Hollywood is a place built on illusions. It takes fragile human beings, turns them into gods, and then watches as those gods crumble under the weight of perfection. Few stories embody this cycle more powerfully than Brad Pitt's. At 61, his life is no longer the gleaming fairy tale of red carpets and eternal love, but rather a tale of survival of a man who climbed Olympus only to discover that even gods bleed, even gods weep, even gods grow old. And yet, the myth persists. To millions across the globe, Brad Pitt remains untouchable. His face is still the shorthand for beauty. His name still synonymous with charisma. Young actors entering Hollywood still whisper his name as the benchmark of stardom, the model of what it means to make it. Film historians still place him alongside Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, and Robert Redford, icons whose very presence altered cinema forever. In this sense, Pitt's legacy is secure. He will not be forgotten. His image will live on, flickering across screens long after he is gone. But the myth is not the man. The true story of Brad Pitt at 61 is one of contradictions. Adored but isolated, triumphant but scarred, legendary but lonely. His tragedy is not that he lost everything. He remains rich, famous, admired. His tragedy is that he gained everything and discovered that it was not enough. What he longed for most, peace, love, and lasting connection, remains out of reach. The heartbreak is clearest when seen through the lens of his children. For all his accolades, all his cinematic triumphs, Brad Pitt's deepest wish has always been to be a father. And yet, at 61, he finds himself estranged from some of the very children who once defined his world. This wound, more than any broken marriage or lost fortune, is the wound that refuses to heal. A man who gave so much to audiences now waits for the call that may never come, the reconciliation that may never arrive, and still, he endures. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of Brad Pitt's story. He does not collapse. He does not vanish into obscurity, does not allow bitterness to consume him. He continues to work, to create, to carve meaning from the silence. He pours his pain into art, into producing films that challenge and inspire, into sculpting forms that reflect his inner struggles. He is not destroyed, but he is marked. Marked by loss, by regret, by the cruel knowledge that beauty and fame cannot save a man from himself. What, then, will be the final word on Brad Pitt? Will he be remembered as the golden boy whose star never dimmed? Or as the tragic figure who had it all and still found himself empty? Will his films outlast the scandals? Or will the scandals forever color the way the world sees him? These questions hang unanswered, because his story is still unfolding. At 61, Brad Pitt stands not at the end, but at the threshold of whatever comes next. Perhaps the most haunting image of him now is not on a red carpet, but alone in his studio, chiseling at stone as sunlight filters through high windows. In that image lies the truth, a man trying to carve clarity from chaos, to give form to emotions that words cannot hold. The camera may no longer define him, the gossip columns may no longer thrill him, but the act of creating, of shaping something lasting, still gives him purpose. It is not the purpose the world expects from its idols, But it is real, and perhaps it is enough. The tragedy of Brad Pitt is heartbreaking because it is universal. Strip away the fame and the fortune, and his story is the story of countless men. A boy raised to hide his feelings, a husband who could not hold his marriage together, a father who lost touch with his children, a man who searches for peace in a world that rarely allows it. The difference is that his struggles have been lived on the world stage, magnified and dissected until they no longer seem like a man's private heartbreak, but a form of public entertainment. And yet, therein lies the lesson. Brad Pitt reminds us that no amount of beauty, money, or fame can protect us from pain. That beneath every perfect smile is a human being carrying scars invisible to the eye. That the real measure of a life is not in the applause of strangers, but in the love of those closest to us. And that sometimes, even for the most admired among us, that love is the hardest thing to hold on to. At 61, Brad Pitt's life is a tapestry of brilliance and sorrow, woven together into a story that resists simple conclusions. He is neither simply a hero nor a villain, neither simply blessed nor cursed. He is both, and, in that complexity, lies the truth of his tragedy. Hollywood may continue to polish his myth, but the man himself walks in shadows, searching for light that fame can never provide. And so his story closes not with answers, but with questions. Will Brad Pitt find peace before the curtain falls? Will he reconcile with his children? Or will their distance become permanent? Will his final years be defined by loneliness, or by a quiet redemption born of humility and forgiveness? For now, we cannot know. What we do know is this: Brad Pitt remains one of the most human of Hollywood's gods, and in his humanity lies both his greatness and his sorrow. His tragedy, at 61, is not only his own. It is the tragedy of every life lived beneath impossible expectations, every heart broken by time, every man who discovers that even legends are not immune to loneliness. And perhaps that is why we cannot look away, because in Brad Pitt's heartbreak, we see the reflection of our own.